Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know that life is busy and there's a lot going on, but I'm really excited about this session. And I think it's going to be a really fantastic opportunity for us to talk about how folks can navigate negotiating and especially from the gender lens as well. So for those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is Libby Davis. I am a program manager for the MBA programs team here at Forte. And this session, navigating the tensions of negotiating as a woman, is going to be fantastic. It's a really important topic, and I've already said like 6 times to our faculty presenter, Dr. Kathawalla, that I'm very excited to learn from her today. I'd also like to share that this is a part of Forte's B-School short course virtual event series. And so this brings together industry experts and faculty from our partner schools. So with that, I am just delighted to share that we are having this session today hosted by Georgetown University. So first, I'd like to turn the session over to Molly Scott, who's the Senior Director of Graduate and Executive Degree Program Admissions. She'll share a little bit more about the programs available at this academic institution before introducing our featured speaker. So Molly, it's so good to see you. It's wonderful to have you here today. Feel free to take it away.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Libby, and I'm excited to tell you all a bit more about Georgetown's Executive Master of Business Administration. Our program is a 21-month hybrid program with a DC campus advantage. New to the cohort we're admitting now, what we do is 3 days in a month will be held on our campus in Georgetown. The university was founded in 1789. It's a very vibrant and dynamic university. And then 1 Saturday per month, students will have a synchronous online course together with their cohort. So we think that this new format is really great for continuing to have the connection to our historic campus and also allowing people more flexibility with their work schedules and their travel. We also have a cohort. It's typically 50 to 60 people, and we feel that this is a unique strength of Georgetown in terms of how bonded our cohort becomes through taking classes together, doing projects together, traveling abroad together. And it's a very diverse group of people as well. The average years of work experience are 14. We like to see a minimum of 8 years of work experience. We also have an average age of about 38, and we see 1/3 of diverse US persons, 1/3 of the class women, 1/3 of the class military. Approximately 2/3 of our most recent cohort have international experience and or citizenship. And again, we consider it a global program, and people's backgrounds definitely factor into that global experience. And just to note, our rankings, we're proud of the rankings that you see on the slide, among US schools being number 7 for percentage of women and number 4 for career progress. And now I'd like to say a bit more about Professor Renée Kathawalla. So Professor Kathawalla is visiting assistant professor of management at Georgetown. She teaches courses in the undergraduate business school, in the MBA, and in our executive MBA. And most recently in the executive MBA, she taught negotiations and organizational behavior. She has an area of research in how intrapersonal or internal conflict affects interpersonal relationship in negotiations, which is obviously highly relevant to our topic today. And Renée holds her PhD from Harvard, her MPP from Vanderbilt, and her BA from University of Notre Dame. So I want to thank her for coming to do this lecture with you, and I'll pass it to you, Renée.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Molly. Let me go ahead and share a screen here. Okay, so if we want to just dive right into our topic for today, negotiating or navigating the tensions of negotiating as a woman, I want to give you a quick overview of kind of the flow of the talk for today, starting first with a negotiation overview. So I want to talk a little bit about what is a negotiation and how do you know what you want in a negotiation. Then we'll talk a little bit more about these sources of internal conflict, looking at where internal conflict comes from, then looking deeper into the implications for women, like why does internal conflict matter so much for women? What might be some of the unique challenges that women have to encounter because of being seen as a woman in a negotiation context. And then what can you actually do about it? How can we navigate internal conflict in a more effective way so that we can walk into a negotiation feeling prepared to advocate for the thing that we really want? And I do want to also note that throughout the talk, I'll be using gender binary terminology since that's how the research has been conceptualized around gender dynamics in negotiation. And I want to mention that the experiences and examples that I will be highlighting are certainly not limited to things that women experience, but for reasons that we will discuss a little bit on, some of the societal stereotypes and gender expectations around women could present unique challenges. So just want to kind of put that context out there. All right, so if I were to give you a link for, to kind of submit your words and associations and images that come to mind when you think about the word negotiations, my guess is that it might look something like this, if we were to do a little Wordle, or images that look kind of like this. So looking really at more of the kind of formal negotiation contexts, looking at things like job offers, salary negotiations, promotions, some of the even like physical images around handshakes or sitting across a table, or maybe having some, conflicting or argumentative body language. Maybe some things around more masculine stereotypes around having suits, things like mergers and acquisitions, like very formalized business contexts, and very quantitative things like money, salary, of course. And those are all, of course, negotiation contexts. But I want to think much more broadly about many more types of negotiation that we engage in a lot more frequently than some of these more formal professional contexts. So in terms of definition of how I think is a useful way of thinking about negotiation, we might think about it as a back and forth communication where people are designed to reach an agreement. People are working together to come to some sort of an agreement on the thing that they're talking about. Or as a means of getting what you want from others. So anytime you're asking someone for something, that would be considered a negotiation. And so the reality is that when we kind of conceptualize negotiation in those terms, that we realize we're constantly negotiating things that are both big and small and personal and professional. So if we were going to look at a nice little 2x2 matrix here of thinking about the small issues and the big issues in the professional and personal contexts, we might think about some examples in the small professional context, like balancing non-promotable tasks with colleagues. So we all want to be good team players, but we know, in fact, for women especially, there's a lot of research on our tendency to take up more of our share of the non-promotable tasks, and maybe trying to navigate with other colleagues, whether they're male or female, how to balance that out a little bit more. It might feel like kind of a small issue in the moment, but has larger implications. Or things like work schedules and internal deadlines, even something like negotiating with a teammate about how you're going to hand off, their part of the project, if you're working together on a consulting project, for example, doing those internal deadlines so that it works for everyone. In the personal context, we might think about smaller issues like balancing household chores with partners or roommates. I'm sure everyone in here has probably experienced this, maybe even as early as or recently as this morning. Things like weekend social plans. Who are you going to be spending your time with? Are you going to be spending more alone time or together time, depending on how you, the dynamics of the people you surround yourself with? How do you think about making sure that all parties are kind of getting at least some element of what they need? Again, not things we always think about as negotiations, but certainly are. And then the big issues are aligned, obviously, in the professional context with things that we already talked about, new job or promotion, new responsibilities, compensation. And then in the personal context, things like marriage, family finances, parenting decisions, all like really big issues that require some sort of back and forth agreement between the parties involved. So I just want to kind of give these examples as things to keep in mind as we move forward and think about the context of negotiations that you might find yourself in. And in terms of the women part of things, so the historical narrative around women in negotiations has really been rooted in this idea that the reason women don't get as much as men, particularly around like gender wage gap, for example, is that women don't ask. So there's a couple of books that have been really popular over the last couple of decades that have really delved into this idea of how can women ask for what they want. And this has played out both in lab experiments and field studies. So for example, I've highlighted here this 2006 study that looked at among graduating MBAs, nearly 52% of males negotiated their starting salaries compared to only 12.5% of women. And possibly as a result of that, the women's salaries were an average of 8.5% lower than men. And so that's all well and good. Like, it's nice to know, okay, women need to advocate for themselves, and there's possibly reasons why maybe historically we haven't now advocated for ourselves quite as much or asked for what we want, to put it simply. But the problem is that presumes that you have to know what you want. Knowing what you want is crucial for getting a good outcome, because if you walk into any kind of a negotiation without being really rooted in what you're trying to accomplish, like what your ultimate goal is, it's hard to get that thing. But the reality is that's also not such a simple question oftentimes. It seems like it's a simple question, but it's not so simple sometimes. So this question of what do you want raises questions about what is your goal? You might have multiple goals simultaneously. We know that in negotiations, people often care about both the content of the negotiation or the outcome, the thing they're trying to get, as well as the process or the relationship that unfolds in the midst of it. And those might have conflicting goals in terms of how you maintain a relationship and achieve the outcome that you want. You might have different immediate interests versus longer term interests. The thing that you need to do or want right now might not necessarily align with something that's in your longer term interests, or vice versa. What outcome do you want? Is it quantitative? This is what we typically think about with negotiations. Like, of course, if you have a salary idea in mind or a bonus target that you're trying to hit, that could be a little bit clearer, but a lot of times they might be things that are more qualitative. Something like balancing household chores, for example, or balancing non-promotable tasks with colleagues. It's a little bit less clear in terms of what it would look like in terms of an outcome. So what if it's not that clear? And what if you are internally conflicted? So of course, this is the focus for today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think are really 4 key areas where internal conflict comes from, and break these down just a little bit more. So the first is around this idea of ambivalence. And this often is a kind of misunderstood term. People often think of it as kind of like uncertainty or like not really caring so much about what you're trying to accomplish. But really, ambivalence is the experience of having simultaneous positive and negative orientations towards an object. And so that experience when you're feeling like very internally conflicted, for a lot of women, we might see this around something like work-family conflict, where you feel really positive orientations towards, the work aspect, as well as negative orientations towards that. And on the family side, positive orientations towards that and negative orientations towards it. And so this can create a really complex cognitive and oftentimes very emotional environment where it creates conflict inside yourself, where it becomes harder to advocate for the thing that you want because you feel positive and negative about both of them. So that's one area. Another area is looking more at short-term or maybe even more like immediate term versus longer-term interests. So this could be anytime where you have conflicting interests, like the immediate reactions in the heat of a negotiation or an argument. I'm sure nobody in here has ever had the experience of being in the middle of we'll call it a negotiation, but potentially an argument about household chores, and has never had the immediate interest in making sure the other party hears you, or that your immediate interest is in feeling better, getting your emotions off of your chest, which is oftentimes leads to a very different, potentially escalation of conflict than is in your longer term interest of finding ways to actually balance your tasks. But it's in that tension of, in the moment, the thing that you want and that you really want to feel might be different than the outcome that you're trying to accomplish. The third area I think of is like being seen as, and this is really when your wants or the act of advocating for your wants risks your being seen in an undesirable way. So we will talk about this in just a few moments here, but this is especially problematic for women a lot of times because there are such strong societal expectations and stereotypes about the way people expect women to be. And that's a very real thing, unfortunately. And so oftentimes what happens is we have our own internal conflict about knowing that we need to ask for something and maybe even being clear about the thing that we want. So the internal conflict isn't necessarily about not knowing what we want, but more about that difference between the process, how you present yourself and how you might be seen by the other party if you advocate for the thing that you want, which does also create some of that internal tension. And then finally, the fourth category is what I call the shoulds. And this is the idea that oftentimes we actually have an experience where it's not really clear what we really want, or if we feel like we should want something. And again, this is certainly something that we see for women, a lot of societal expectations. I should want that promotion. I should want to be on the partner track. Or I should want to have children. And those kind of narratives, especially depending on the social context that you find yourself in, can be really, really loud and drown out your own ability to kind of hear your own thoughts, which then again, if we think about in the context of trying to get clear about what you want from a negotiation and how to advocate for it, make it really hard to separate out like what is your voice versus somebody else's voice, and then how do you advocate for that once you kind of get some clarity. So I think about this also in the terms of kind of the conscious aspects of internal conflict, as well as the unconscious aspects. So some of this can be, at the conscious level, which is, if that's the case, then that's great, because generally if something is conscious for you, then you can kind of reason through it if you give yourself enough time and thought process to kind of think about the pros and cons, or maybe prioritizing something that you want now and finding ways to negotiate with yourself so that you're set up to get what you want now and something later on. But what I think is actually more common oftentimes is that they're unconscious. So I love the sort of cliche image of the iceberg. I know that it's cliche, but it's cliche for a reason, because it is a really apt metaphor for the way that a lot of these dynamics in our own minds work and the way that they impact the way we show up in the world around us. So to the extent that any of the conflicts that I just walked through are anywhere below the conscious level, so they might be like just slightly below your, sort of self-awareness, or they could be really, really deep. Those are the times when it becomes really difficult and also really important to figure out what it is that you really want. Because if you're unconscious about it, then it evokes defense mechanisms. Because our brains really do not like the experience of having two contradictory things at one time. We have very unconscious ways of dealing with that can very much get in the way of getting what we want, what we actually want in a negotiation. And so a couple of these dynamics that I do want to highlight for you are, one, what we call splitting, which is when you have these kind of two different contradictory things in your mind at the same time. What our minds tend to do is, instead of being able to hold contradictory ideas at the same time, we tend to split them into two, and oftentimes label one of them as good or desirable and the other as bad or undesirable, because that resolves the conflict for our minds, especially if it's, of course, something that we're not conscious of. And then what we do with that is this process of projection, which is basically where we hold on to the half that we've decided is the good or desirable part, and project anything that's bad or undesirable onto another party. And that is where things can get really messy in the context of a negotiation, because if you are negotiating with somebody else who is also potentially maybe having some of these, splitting of the good and the bad, you can get caught into a dynamic where the negotiation isn't really rooted in what either party is actually trying to accomplish or what they want. And you can get kind of lost in that. So a lot of what I want to focus on is kind of what can we do with that? How can we bring some of these things that might be sitting right below our level of consciousness into the more conscious realm so that it can be dealt with and worked with in a more productive way. All right, and so in terms of like why this matters so much for women, some of the challenges and implications of having internal conflict for women, because of course, none of the experiences I just highlighted, even things around work-family conflict or having internal conflict in general, is not at all limited to something that only women have. But we know that there can be a backlash or a social cost for women who negotiate. So oftentimes we think about this in the trade-off of being likable versus competent. So this is most powerful when female stereotypes get activated. So for example, one study I just want to highlight for you is that in an experimental setting where women were told that they had a family emergency at home, and they had to decide whether they wanted to stay at work or go deal with the emergency at home, they basically had two choices. One was to choose to go home and deal with the emergency, in which case participants rated the woman as incompetent or less competent, but likable. Or she could make the other choice, which was to stay at work and not deal with the family emergency, in which case she was seen as unlikable, but competent. Men, did not have the same negative trade-offs. They were really very neutral in terms of the way people perceived them. And so this is important because when we're thinking about the being seen as, or kind of those expectations, societal expectations of like what we really want, that adds a lot of external pressure in terms of how people perceive the choices that we make. There's also interesting data that show that women who initiate salary negotiations are perceived as more demanding, less nice, and less desirable to work with. So there really is like this backlash or this social cost. There are ways that women can deal with this by oftentimes leaning into the stereotypes, kind of negotiating on behalf of other people, thinking like you're kind of working towards other people's interests. But the dynamic really is there for women. And interestingly, I started earlier in the talk talking about how there was this narrative that women don't ask. And a very recent study that just came out last year found that women actually do ask now. So that narrative has become so widespread and popularized and widely acknowledged that a lot of women do actually advocate for themselves now, both in experimental settings and in the lab. So this most recent study looked at recent female MBA grads who initiated salaries, and they actually negotiated or initiated salary negotiations more often than males, but were still paid less. So it raises interesting questions about what this historical narrative does and maybe why we hold on to it so much. And there's an argument to make that that narrative is not so much rooted in reality, especially potentially not anymore. It's changed a lot over the last couple of decades, but that it's still used as a way to justify the status quo wage gap between women and men in ways that are not actually grounded in real data, that there might be a lot of other things going on there that we kind of mask over by believing that women just don't ask. Okay, and then so in terms of additional sets of challenges for women, one is that one of the unintended consequences of women's advancement in the workplace is that it has coincided with this devaluing of caregiving tasks. So people who often talk about things like work-family conflict tend to see the family side of things as like a duty or something they're supposed to be doing, like very obligation-bound, rather than seeing it as something that people aspire to do, like something that people really care about, might be aligned with larger goals for their life. Again, certainly not limited to women, but societally tends to be more aligned with female stereotypes, but it has really devalued that, which in some ways has exacerbated the narrative around the work-family conflict. And also, even though this work-family conflict does tend to be more associated with women versus men, we do also have some really interesting studies that have looked at how men experience work-family conflict, that they still very much have it, but they sort of engage in their own version of splitting and projection, where they kind of take the ideas of feeling like they're experiencing conflict, and instead of owning it and feeling it for themselves, they kind of say, oh, well, it's the women's problem. So I have this quote here. I'm not going to read the whole quote for you, but basically it's a male, a very senior male at a big consulting firm, who was talking about this like deep love he felt for his daughter as soon as she was born. He says, like, I couldn't imagine a world without her. I fell so chemically deeply in love with her. And then kind of immediately turns and says, like, I can understand, how can I possibly give this up and go back to work? Almost like it's the women's problem. I'm not conflicted about it, even though he's just used this like very stark language. So again, all of this kind of feeds back into the sort of external sources of pressure that can make any internal conflict that women have so much harder to listen to for yourself, and make it harder to figure out, what do I really want? How am I going to advocate for it? So in line with that, I'm going to close with just like a tool for you to kind of think about how you can deal more effectively with this internal conflict. So first, I hope that, going through some of these concepts from today does highlight a little bit more a broader range of issues and contexts in which you negotiate. And also maybe bring to the surface some of these situations where you feel a little bit more internally conflicted than you may have realized prior to this. All right, so the acronym that I think is really helpful is SLOW down, very apt for, kind of slowing down our brain. And so the S stands for stop. I'm going to go through these in a little bit more depth briefly. The L stands for listen. The O stands for own. And the W stands for wonder. So first is stop. The first thing, once you notice any kind of internal conflict, is just to notice it and just take a pause. Take a deep breath, take a step back. Try not to immediately react or go on autopilot. This is especially important for those times when internal conflict is held right below the surface, because those are the moments when anytime that gets activated, we're going to engage kind of automatically in the splitting and potentially projection, and it's going to really challenge our ability to think strategically about what we really want. All right, so the next is to listen. So here, what I mean by listen is to really listen to yourself. Thinking about things like, what is actually going on in my mind right now? What can I articulate about the internal conflict I'm experiencing? Even trying to ask yourself that question and answer it, like, what can I articulate, might bring to the surface a realization that there are things that you're feeling, but you can't quite articulate. If so, that's a great chance to say, like, all right, let me try to articulate what I can, and then go from there. But again, even just making that effort to articulate it gets you leaps and bounds ahead of where you were beforehand. And then trying to get clear to the extent you can on, what kind of internal conflict is it? Am I feeling ambivalent, positive and negative feelings towards both of my options or all of my options? Is it short-term versus long-term? The pressure to be seen as versus advocate for what I want? Or a case of the shoulds, like something I really want, or is it something I think other people want of me or that I should want? So really stopping to listen for yourself. Own. So own is one of the hardest, I think probably one of the hardest, if not the hardest steps of this process. But really, I mean, own your experience, your thoughts, feelings, desires. Ask yourself questions like, what about this internal conflict is difficult to face? What are the difficult or uncomfortable thoughts and feelings that I need to own? And how can I hold this tension without splitting it into two halves? So how can I claim all parts of this experience, even the conflict, as my own, and kind of be okay with that, not immediately try to resolve it, or hold on to one and get rid of the other, but rather to hold it all together, and have a more comprehensive picture of your thoughts and desires and feelings. And then the last step is to wonder. So this is where getting curious about your experience and your perspective can be really helpful. So you might ask yourself things like, how might I think about this internal conflict differently? Is there a way to reframe it so that I can hold on to my reality while gaining clarity about what I want? And what other perspectives can I consider? Is there a different way of thinking about this conflict or negotiation than the way that I've currently been thinking about it? Hopefully, going through the prior steps does kind of release your mind a little bit from the constraints that you have around the perspective of whatever it is that you're negotiating, to kind of think more broadly, more expansively about what you might want and how you might go about getting it. So in summary, getting clarity on what you want really starts with, getting clarity on what you want in a negotiation requires you to get clarity on what you really, really want, which we know is oftentimes more difficult than we might realize. And there is a cost to not being clear. So if you're not clear, you don't have clear goals, the ask might not be clear, other people might kind of push their wants onto you and you might get lost in the midst of it. So there is a real cost to not having that clarity. Doing things like introspective questioning, what I just presented with this slow process or framework, can help you in the clarifying process. And then help you kind of get to the end point where now you know kind of what you want and how to ask for it, potentially or hopefully in a way that will be more aligned with societal expectations to the extent you have to consider that, and kind of, moving forward to get what you really want. All right, so I have my email here. I think it's time to open it up for any questions. So thank you all, and I hope this has been helpful. I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kathawalla. I'll start with one that's in the Q&A feature. Someone asked, when I get into a negotiation situation or a situation where I'm trying to explain myself, sometimes I start crying. It's so frustrating, and I feel like I undermine myself. Is there a suggestion for how you cannot do that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And thank you so much for that. I think that's a really honest and real experience that a lot of us have. So the way that I would really think about that is, to the extent that you can, like, a couple of steps. So first, I would try to think about, like, when are the examples or types of negotiations when that experience has come up for you. Maybe even kind of keeping a list of it, like the time I was negotiating with my boss about a promotion, or a colleague about our work balance, or whatever it might be. To kind of think about, when were the times that came up. See if you notice any patterns about, maybe it was something in the dynamics with that particular person. Maybe it was something about advocating for yourself. To the extent that you can notice commonalities between those experiences. And then anytime you find yourself in a situation where you're about to negotiate in the future, or you think you might, practicing. I know this might sound a little kind of silly, but one of the big things that we do when we teach negotiations in the classroom is we do a lot of exercises and role playing. So having role playing, I think, again, it feels very unnatural a lot of times, but it's a super helpful way of getting yourself in the frame of mind of being able to anticipate the kinds of things that the other person is going to say, think about them ahead of time, and to try to really understand, like, what is kind of going on in your own mind, and hold on to your reality in the midst of that negotiation. So practice, practice, practice is the biggest thing. So yeah, that's pretty much the advice.
Thank you so much. Other questions: how would you open the conversation around negotiating a raise when it has been a dead end in previous attempts?
That's an interesting one. If you've already had different negotiations. So I would, again, think, if especially the more you have experience in some of these things, if they haven't gone well, try to think about, how did I approach it in the past? How did they respond? What commonalities do I notice? We know that for women, one of the things that tends to work really well is to the extent that you can, negotiate on behalf of the group. It aligns more with traditionally feminine stereotypes of being very cooperative. So if you can, ask, like, or advocate for something for yourself, because it's going to let you do a better job for the team or for the organization. That is one tactic that has traditionally worked well for women in particular.
Great, thank you. Then can you provide an example of how someone might answer this question for themselves? Is there a way to reframe it so that I can hold on to my reality while still getting clarity about what I want, which is part of
Yeah,
one?
so that's a good question. So if we think about something like, all right, in the work family conflict, for example, if it's something like on a big scale, like taking a promotion, or not, or if it's something as small as negotiating whose responsibility it's going to be to clean up the dishes and load the dishwasher, whether it's like really big or small. What I mean by reframing is more about, that sort of sees it as a trade-off. Like, I'm either doing something for my work or doing something for my home. Is there a way to reframe it in terms of, how do we think about our partnership differently, rather than like, I'm doing the traditionally female things or I'm not, but rather, maybe we think about, like, we're working together towards this, and we're almost like dividing and conquering, or like treating our relationship like we're managing an organization and we're just kind of trading different roles. So reframing, not so much even the task, but the relationship and the dynamic that context, that negotiation is happening in the context of.
That sounds like a practical approach. And then more questions: how can women get over imposter syndrome when they're in a negotiation?
So I have probably an unpopular answer here, but I would say, embrace it, because the reality is that almost everyone has imposter syndrome, even if it's not just limited to women, although women probably do experience it more acutely in certain contexts. And also practice. Like, the more you kind of acknowledge, like, I'm feeling imposter syndrome about this in that preparation process, the less power it's going to have over you when you actually get into the negotiation. So trying to, acknowledge that it's there, almost like in a meditative sense, like, see that it's there and let it kind of pass you by, and then stay focused on the thing that you're trying to accomplish, as opposed to trying to prove yourself, because oftentimes that effort of trying to overcome the imposter syndrome actually leads to some more of the backfiring dynamics. It can make women kind of seem a little bit more defensive or assertive in a way that doesn't serve them, unfortunately. And again, I kind of hesitate to harp on some of these things, but it is because it's so well rooted in the research around societal norms and expectations that women have to kind of at least know exist, that you can decide for yourself how you want to navigate it in the negotiation, but knowing that it exists and kind of playing within that to the extent that you can is probably a good way to go.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions on the theme of, like, what do you do when you're told you're being too intense, or you are sounding and looking angry in a negotiation, but then the other person is being patronizing, condescending? How do you kind of navigate that emotional terrain?
Okay, so there's a few layers to this, at least from what I'm hearing initially, that part of it is your own emotions about it, which I think is a really great way to phrase that question. Like, and very much in line with kind of the slow idea of, like, all you can do in any negotiation or any conversation for that matter is control your own part. I would say my sense is that in the kinds of situations that you've just mentioned, like if somebody's being patronizing or telling you you're being, too assertive or too demanding, my sense is that those are probably in interactions with people that it's not a one-time thing. It's like somebody you regularly interact with, like maybe a boss or a coworker or a partner or even. And in that case, I think looking more closely at the dynamic between the two people and trying to understand, like, as much as you can take the perspective of the other person, like, remember this, the kind of unconscious splitting and projection that I talked about, almost that, I mean, that happens for everyone. So I would say if somebody is making comments like, you're too demanding or too this or too sensitive or whatever, that I would bet is probably coming from some element that that other person is experiencing, that they've kind of like pushed away from themselves and they're finding it in you. So to the extent that if that might be their reality, of course you can't know that, but keeping in mind, in your own mind, that that might be what's going on for them can help you kind of really hold on to your own reality and like not worry so much about what that other person is saying necessarily. Let I guess at least lower the power that it might have over you. And also remembering that in any kind of a dynamic, dynamics are reciprocal. So if one person changes their approach in a dynamic, it inherently kind of breaks whatever the cycle was. So if you ask a question in a different way or try to take a different type of an approach, the other person might react in a different way than what they have in the past. So again, these are very challenging. Unfortunately, there's not one like, do this and it will help. I wish there was, but being really mindful about what might be going on for that other person and trying as much as you can to just realize, like, you can only control yourself, know what's going on in your own mind, and don't get pulled into whatever is going on for them. Because it sounds like if people are saying comments like that, it's not necessarily, it doesn't sound like they're necessarily trying to take your perspective or negotiate in a very constructive manner, to put it potentially diplomatically.
Thank you. And then in format, if you're given a verbal or written offer, sorry, may you counter that in written form, or do you feel like verbal negotiations allow you to get further? That was advice that was given long ago in my own career, like, do not discuss a job offer in writing, only do it verbally. But I don't know if there are any words of wisdom you can pass on.
That's a great question. So I'm sure there has probably been research on this, especially maybe in the last like few years since COVID, where things have been less face-to-face or verbal. I don't know. My initial reaction is, I do think maybe there is something to that face-to-face element, but I think it's less so much, in my mind at least, about the face-to-face and more about the ability to ask questions and understand what the other party wants. What are your interests? What would be beneficial for you? Whether that, even if it's like a salary or a job offer, trying to get a sense of like what the other party really, what would be valuable for the organization or for the team. And I think maybe you have an easier time like having a back and forth and demonstrating your commitment to the team or the organization if you're face to face. But I don't know. I don't know if there would be a hard and fast rule. Other people might have different perspectives though, but that's sort of my personal take on that.
And I think we can take one more question. Do you have any specific experience or insights in negotiating for protections against layoffs? This person has had several of those and wants to negotiate in the future for some protection.
Interesting. So protection, meaning like in advance of any kind of potential layoff.
Sounds like something contractual.
Yeah. So I would say, so the first thing that comes to mind for me is like thinking about what we would call like a contingency contract, like in the initial negotiation stage, to the extent that you can maybe even preemptively address in the event of a layoff, this is what would happen. Or something like that. I honestly don't have any like personal experience having thought about that, but thinking about kind of other types of negotiation contexts where basically like you come to an agreement that then later on gets revisited and kind of in a lot of ways undoes what you feel you have already agreed on, which is in some ways what I think maybe a layoff might feel like if it's not, especially if it's not for cause, which sounds like in this context, probably not. That's the first thing that comes to mind for me. But I think that's a really tough question, honestly.
Thank you, Dr. Kathawalla, for sharing your information and letting us pick your brain on these topics. And then I think that Forte and Libby have a few more words.
All right, thank you all so much.
Yes, no, I just want to say again, thank you, Dr. Kathawalla. I was very into your presentation, and I think everything you said about like really the only thing you can control is how you respond and how you react to things, and I think that's very, very true. So I appreciate you sharing all of that helpful information today. So I just wanted to mention for folks that we do here at Forte have a lot of really exciting events and activities that are taking place quite frequently. There's always something that's going on at Forte, and the B-School Short Course Series that you joined today is just one of the many. So we just want to invite you to continue to engage with us and to meet other really fantastic experts like Dr. Kathawalla in the future. But with that, I know that we are just about at time, so I wanted to thank you once again for being here today, for sharing your thoughtful questions. I think that this kind of discussion always adds kind of a depth to the conversation that you can't get in other situations. So thank you for that. And with that, we'll let you get on with your day. We hope to see you really soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye.